Hi there, my name's Ellen Holloway. I am the host of Charting Toward Intimacy, a podcast that aims at expanding the natural family planning conversation from a Catholic perspective. I also teach a symptothermal method of natural family planning called SymptoPro, and I do a lot of coaching and courses around choosing the right method for you and just living with NFP and how to work through the difficulties that comes when you are using NFP in your marriage. So I'm going to be answering the question, do I have to use natural family planning? And the answer to that is a little bit more than just a yes or a no. So first off, the church teaches that there is an inherent link between the unitive and procreative aspects of sex. This means that the fact that a man and a woman physically and emotionally unite during an act of intercourse is inherently linked to the fact that they have the capacity to create life during that same act of intercourse. I say capacity to create life because not every act of intercourse is going to be creating a new life. But every act of intercourse does need to remain open to that procreative aspect. That procreative aspect cannot be taken away. Pope Paul VI said in his encyclical Humanae Vitae, "The Church teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life." Pope Paul VI goes on in the next section to kind of better explain this and to dive in a little bit deeper. He says, "The fundamental nature of the marital act, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating new life. And this as a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and woman." So what are things that take away that procreative aspect? What does it mean to omit that procreative aspect? Well, things that interrupt the generative process take away that procreative aspect. So what are some things that interrupt the generative process? I'm actually going to go through a whole list of them with you. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is hormonal birth control. I'm talking about the pill, the patch, the hormonal IUD, an injection, did I get them all? Anything that is using hormones to suppress ovulation is going to be interrupting that generative process. Because what is the generative process? The generative process requires an egg from a woman, it requires ovulation, and it requires sperm from a man. So when we're trying to oppress or suppress ovulation, we are messing with that generative process. We're interrupting it. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about that interrupts that generative process is barrier methods of contraception. So things like condoms, the sponge, a diaphragm, things like that are actually creating a physical barrier. It's actually really easy for us to see this connection of how it is interrupting the generative process because that physical barrier is interrupting the ability for the sperm to unite with the egg. Or for the sperm at least to get into the vagina and uterus and fallopian tubes where it could have the ability to unite with an egg if it is the proper time in the woman's cycle. The next one I want to talk about is the Copper Iud. So the way that the Copper Iud works is it secretes copper into the fallopian tubes, making it an inhospitable environment for sperm. And so thus interrupting the generative process by killing the sperm. Spermicides work in a similar way as far as interrupting the generative process goes. So spermicides are trying to kill the sperm. They're trying to also create an inhospitable environment for sperm, which is interrupting that generative process, the ability for the sperm to get where they're supposed to be. Coitus interruptus, also known as the pull-out method, more colloquially, this one is also really clear in how it is interrupting that generative process. It's actually in the name, right? Coitus interruptus. It is interrupting a full act of intercourse between a man and a woman. It is pulling out right before the man reaches orgasm and ejaculates. And so interrupting the ability for the sperm to get where it's supposed to be. And the last one I want to talk about is emergency contraception. So things like Plan B. These are going to work in similar ways to hormonal birth control, except in much higher doses of hormones. So it's going to try to suppress ovulation if that's possible. It's going to try to interrupt the fertilization, and it's going to try to stop implantation, whichever stage is kind of happening there. And then it also has abortifacient properties. So it is interrupting the generative process in a couple of different ways, just depending on where the woman's at in her cycle. Okay, so we've covered the things that interrupt that natural generative process. But what is it that doesn't interrupt that natural generative process? Well, one thing that doesn't interrupt that natural generative process is complete and total abstinence. If you don't ever begin the generative process, you can't end the generative process before it is supposed to be complete. You can't interrupt it. So if a couple is trying to avoid pregnancy, a completely morally licit means of avoiding pregnancy, albeit probably very difficult, would be completely abstaining from intercourse and genital contact. What is another way that doesn't interrupt the generative process? Having intercourse during naturally occurring times of infertility does not interrupt the generative process because the infertility is naturally occurring. It's already there. So things like having intercourse after a woman has reached menopause. There is nothing interrupting the generative process there. Her body has already gone through its entire generative cycle of life. Another time would be during pregnancy. A woman is naturally infertile then because she is creating a baby inside of her already. And right after pregnancy, there's typically going to be a period of time that is also infertile. And one other time that I want to talk about is the naturally occurring infertile periods during a woman's cycle. There's always going to be an amount of time that is infertile every cycle for a woman. And so having intercourse during that time does not interrupt the generative process because naturally the generative process isn't actually happening because naturally the woman is infertile. So back to our original question, do I have to use NFP? Well, if you and your spouse don't have a reason to avoid pregnancy, then no, you can absolutely just forget about trying to chart your cycle and figure out when you're infertile or fertile. You don't have any requirement to use natural family planning. Now, if you and your spouse do have a reason to avoid pregnancy and are looking to avoid pregnancy for a short or extended period of time, you have two options. You can completely abstain from intercourse during that amount of time, whether it be a couple of months or a couple of years, or you can use natural family planning and abstain during the woman's naturally occurring fertile times and have intercourse during the woman's naturally occurring infertile times. Does it matter which method? No. Can I use the calendar rhythm method? Absolutely. My caveat there is that it's not going to be as effective as one of the more modern methods of fertility awareness that are going to be in other videos during this entire NFP collective. Can I switch methods? Absolutely. Can I learn from a book? Sure. Again, your efficacy is going to be lower, but if that's okay with you, there's nothing morally wrong with that. Can you just try to figure it out on your own? Sure, but I personally am always going to advocate for you to find an instructor because your efficacy rate is going to be much, much higher. In other videos, they're going to be talking about efficacy rates and the fact that using fertility awareness with perfect use puts you up in the 98 to 99% effective range. If you're learning from a book, an online forum, trying to DIY it, that efficacy is going to drop much, much lower. Maybe you're going to be around 75%, 80, maybe even lower, maybe 70 or 65%. If that doesn't matter to you, That's fine. You don't have to use one of the methods that is being covered over the course of this weekend. But what you do need to ensure is that the method you are using is using the natural design of the woman's fertile and infertile periods and not introducing any form of contraception. So, for example, some secular fertility awareness instructors will teach you to use a condom or barrier method during the fertile time. That is not licit. We've already talked about condoms and other barrier methods and how that is interrupting the generative process. So, to sum it all up, if you are trying to avoid pregnancy, you have two options. Your first option is 100% abstinence. Your second option is to use natural family planning and fertility awareness to identify the fertile and infertile periods of time in the woman's cycle and abstain during the fertile periods of time. Doesn't matter which method you use, doesn't matter how you learn. My biggest suggestion for you is to check out the other videos throughout this weekend and learn about the different methods and figure out what's going to be the best choice for you.